I'm lucky where I live in that I have Loch Awe, a sea loch outside my back door, and Loch Awe, a freshwater loch outside my front door. At 25 miles long is Scotland's longest freshwater loch. It had been a couple of years since I last launched a boat there, simply because access near my home is not so easy. I have to carry all my gear, including the boat, down a very steep and often slippery concrete slope. It's certainly not a slipway, as I couldn't drive down even though I have a four-wheel drive. It's just too steep, and the last few feet have been removed to deter others trying. 2 years ago I slipped in winter algae, carrying my 27-kilogram outboard down the slope, and gave myself a sore one, so stopped going there. However, now I have a lightweight setup. I couldn't wait to get back in the loch. Although that's just a term of phrase, as I had to wait several weeks due to September's unusual period of wet and windy weather, until eventually the forecast promised a reasonable day. And then I was there. Although I had to make several journeys back and forth to the car, it was a breeze carrying a 12-kilogram, 3.3 horsepower outboard down the slope, and also a 30-kilogram cabboat. My plan was to motor at displacement speed and paddle when I had the energy, all in an effort to keep myself fit. I'm an early bird, so left the launch point around 8:30 a.m. It was a lovely calm morning, just as the forecast promised. I was heading for the interesting islands of Eilean, Fraoch and Eilean, Bhuaidh, where I intended landing to have a coffee break to make sure I was fully awakened. The little two-stroke happily purred along on 1/3 throttle, possibly around 5 miles per hour, which suits this type of relaxed boating perfectly. I'm in no hurry to go anywhere. I set course for Eilean, Bhuaidh first, as I knew of a small secret bay to land in, have coffee and let the drone look over the island, including Fraoch Eilean and its ancient castle. I had to paddle into the sheltered bay as the entrance was only around 6 inches deep. I wondered if the wee bay was man-made by the ancient Argylls who built Castle Fraoch in the adjacent island. As I enjoyed my coffee in the early morning light, the drone enjoyed its flight, as it had been a while since it was last out its box. I then paddled across to Eilean Fraoch, which means Heather Island. I landed on a small stone beach to the west of the castle, then took a stroll to have a good gawk at the ruins. I let the drone have a look too, although it was not easy getting it out and then back through the overgrown foliage. The castle ruins date back to medieval times, when it's believed King Alexander III gave it to Clan MacNaughton in 1267. In exchange that they would keep the castle repaired and secured, and Alexander would be able to use it when he visited Argyll. During the 14th century, the castle was then passed on to the Campbell clan, who also owned Kilchurn Castle and Inishail, before another MacNaughton retook the castle in 1745. It's believed Bonnie Prince Charlie may have visited it following his landing at Glenfinnan, before it was finally abandoned in 1769. So it has a very colourful history. I couldn't help but wonder what all these important historical figures would have thought of me now standing in the ruins of a castle, filming it from a flying camera. I then boarded the boat, started the outboard, and made my way to the very northern tip of Loch Awe. A very enjoyable journey in the flat, calm water. St. Conan's Church looked magnificent, illuminated in the morning sun. And so did the Loch Awe Hotel, reflected perfectly in the calm surface. Some ominous-looking clouds started collecting around the hills as I approached the far end of the loch and Kilchurn Castle, which was to be my next stop. When I landed in a small isle opposite the castle, it looked ready to start pouring, so I quickly threw the drone in the air before it had a chance to start raining. In its heyday, Kilchurn Castle was not only a fortress, but it was also a garrison stronghold. Built in the mid-1400, by the Campbells of Glenorchy, it was their base for 150 years. When the Campbells became Earls of Breadalbane, they moved to Taymouth Castle, and Kilchurn fell out of use and was in ruins by 1770 after it was badly damaged in a lightning storm. I could now see the rain and a squall of wind coming up the loch, so I quickly brought the drone back while I sheltered under a tree. The drone was as dry as a bone in its box. My spirits were slightly dampened as the weather forecast had mentioned only 5% chance of rain that day. But I guess I should have expected it, as it had rained every day for the past 2 weeks. September was a very wet month on the west coast of Scotland this year. I did look on the bright side though, as I got my footage of the castle, and I also had my waterproofs on the boat. So as the rain started, I was dry under the trees, although my mouth got wet slurping a coffee, waiting for the rain to stop. It didn't last too long, although it was now very damp looking, and the loch was no longer mirror smooth. I started heading south, back down the loch, heading for the island of Inishail. A brief ray of sun illuminated one of the many Crannog islands in the loch. Prehistoric man built these round rocky platforms around the edges and made their homes on them, presumably to keep away from wolves and knowing they would be easier to protect from enemies being surrounded by water. It rained off and on my way to Innishail, where I landed in another small stone bay. There is no castle in Innishail, however, there are the remains of an ancient church, possibly built by St Finda, and an early burial ground with some ancient gravestones. There are 1 or 2 more recent headstones too, including the 11th and the 12th Dukes of Argyll. It was once very common to bury the dead in islands, as roaming wolves often dug up the fresh bodies to eat them. There were no wolves in the islands, so folk of the old knew their loved ones would be left in peace and not chewed to pieces. Having paid my respects, I then clambered back into the boat and started heading further southwards. I I didn't get far though, as the wind started rising and the rain came on again. I decided to call it a day and head back to the launch point. I got back just as the heavens opened and the rain tumbled down. Although the weather had been disappointing, I had thoroughly enjoyed my day, and as the following day forecast again promised slight winds and 5% chance of rain, I decided to explore the southern end of the loch in the morning. I drove down to the village of Ford and again launched from a lay-by, this time around 75 metres from the water's edge, so once again I was happy at the lightweight boat. In truth, initially the weather looked very much like the previous day, so I expected some rain. However, the loch soon turned mirror smooth, and although it was a grey morning, it certainly didn't rain. I forgot to mention that I rely on my depth gauge fish finder when boating in the loch. The depth varies considerably, often 200 feet deep, and just off the banks around 50 feet deep. However, it can suddenly go to a foot or so deep where you least expect it, so in my opinion, a depth sounder is a must. I ran into 6 inches of water at the end of this island, but the depth sounder gave plenty warning. I pulled over for my morning coffee and let the drone loose here. A white-tailed eagle flew off as I landed. The island is Innischonnell and a protected nature reserve. There are no ruins on it, so I didn't land. I was only stopping for a break on my way to Innischonnell. There is a lovely ruined castle. The drone quickly lost interest too and came back early, so we set off again. I passed several more little Crannog islands on the way to Innischonnell, which indicate the loch was a popular area many years ago. Rounding this headland, I now get a good view along the length of Loch Awe, with the Kilchurn hills in the far horizon. I could now see Eilean, which is not far from Innischonnell. And not long later I was approaching Innischonnell and its ancient castle. I landed in a little bay beside the ruins. It was lovely to be back here, as it had been a few years since I ventured this far down the loch. I headed for an area of open ground beside the castle and let the drone loose. This castle was another Clan Campbell stronghold, possibly built around the 11th century. In 1308, John MacDougall held the castle against Robert the Bruce. The Campbells eventually left the castle in the 15th century, but it was still used as a prison. Black Donald, heir to the Lordship of the Isles, was one of the many kept here. By the 19th century, the castle was in ruins. I last camped here during the COVID lockdowns of 2020, and it's a popular spot for camping, and sadly some irresponsible camper couldn't be bothered taking their tent home, and it's lying rotting away inside the castle walls. I often come across such abandoned tents, a sad sign of modern day living. Fortunately, these tents won't last as long as the castles in Loch Awe. When the drone returned, I clambered up the steep stone steps that lead to the castle walls for a look around and fresh my memory cells of sitting up here with a can of beer, having small talk with a friend as we listened to cuckoos calling. It was springtime. Those days of COVID lockdowns were hard, as we didn't really know what was going to happen or when COVID lockdowns would end, if it ever would. But I still have some good memories of those times. Then I headed back to the boat and made my way back down the loch. I had planned on stopping in one of the small islands on the way back for my lunch, but the loch was so smooth and my seats so comfortable, I just had lunch on the move. I certainly couldn't have done that the day before. Although it had been a dull, overcast morning, the sun did start to break through in the afternoon. I was now approaching my last ruined castle in Loch Awe, Kilchurn Castle. It's a small ruin compared to the others, and I can't find much information about it, except it was possibly built around 1240, although these ruins would have been from a later period. It possibly belonged to the MacLeans or McMartin clan. I must admit I really enjoyed revisiting the castles of Loch Awe, despite getting soaked on my first day visiting Kilchurn and Fraoch. I happily headed back to the car, knowing my journey was accomplished, and I promised myself I wouldn't leave it for so long before visiting them all again. It was an easy task carrying the boat and equipment up to the car, and my day was done. I hope you enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching.